No, I'm not going to print anything.
Today's okay. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Hope you had a great weekend. Those of you who watch Super Bowl, hope you enjoy. Chiefs being crushed. It was very entertaining to watch. So as I said last time, we're gonna shift gears and start talking about internals of the system. So far, we talked a lot about interaction with physical world and different things that can happen as a result. But now, since we are in second half of the class, which is also crazy how soon we got into week 6, we start going to talk about more internals. When I say internals, I mean digital aspects of IoT systems. And we're going to start with malware. That's basically where it starts. Before jumping into that, I think I talked to almost everyone about their projects. Should be your number one priority from now because it's taking a lot of time, of course, and there's not much time. Fortunately, like quarter systems, but I would say the most negative thing about quarter system is like it doesn't give you enough time for research, like doing the proper like a project. Uh, but I mean, there are a few weeks, and there are like 3, 4 of you in most groups, so you can hopefully kind of divide the work nicely and do something. The goal of the project is mainly for you to go a little bit deeper, as I said at the beginning of the class, and kind of learn something new and explore. So don't just kind of like just implement something for the sake of implementation. Try to think about it, play a little bit with different ideas, test out things. It's okay if it doesn't work. The idea is that getting you prepared for real world, right? So in real world, you're going to be facing with real challenges and you need to start testing things out and see which one is working, which one is not working. The faster that you can get into something that is working, the more successful you will be. So now it's a good time for you to practice that kind of skill set. It's not about, oh, you show me like great results. It's about, can you actually develop that kind of skill set in yourself of thinking about problems and coming up with solutions and testing out those solutions and see whether they work or not. And then hopefully when you do it multiple times, you get good at it. So then you become very productive person in your career, whatever you're going to do. So start doing that. I think still there are a few people missing from the projects, and I'm not sure if they're planning to keep the course or not. But again, remember that project is a big part of the grades. Uh, Email me if you haven't done schedule a meeting with me yet. I know that a few people will also reach out after the class today. Okay. Uh, does anyone have any questions about logistics and all? Okay, we're good. All right, so let's talk about malware. So here is the kind of the status code, the TLDR so far. That we talked about we talked about sensors and hardware, and we said that essentially the operations we can load the program correctly using secure boot. Even if everything about the system is secure, unfortunately, since you're operating in an adversarial environment, there are lots of things that adversary can change and launch an attack. We talked about lots and lots of them, different modalities, different types, at different times. We also talked about information leakage and side channels. We talked about faults. And then finally, we talked about interaction between sensors and programs and other things such as machine learning. So hopefully you're now an expert in that aspects of things. But there are unfortunately lots of other issues that the systems might experience during the operation. So what could happen is that as the systems start interacting through inputs and outputs, unfortunately, the attacker still can manipulate the system and change the system. This manipulation no longer is by changing some physical environment, but it's by forcing the system to make some decisions, mainly through sending some malicious inputs, digital inputs, or kind of, as we're going to discuss, some form of a social engineering where it forced the user to make some incorrect decisions. How do we do that? Essentially, the goal on kind of, as I said, on the digital aspect is we want to force the system to run some form of malicious software. Okay. So we're not trying to change any physical environments or physical entity. We are trying to literally run some malicious software into the program. Okay. So how do we exactly do that? There are kind of three types of the copier should be seen correctly. Okay. There are three things that one can do. The first group of attacks that happens in this domain is when you force the user to download some files. This is kind of a more traditional way of attacking the systems. So you, as an attacker, writes a malicious software, which we typically call it a malware, and then you somehow trick the users of a particular device to download this file and run it on the system. We're going to give you some examples of how this could happen, but probably many of you have received some emails that you have won $1 million and you open this attachments to get the money, and those are the examples of things like that. But there's also more sophisticated examples, obviously. The second group, which is more common and significantly more dangerous, is exploiting some bugs in the program in order to inject some code. So the injection is, bless you, the injection is happening on the fly as part of the input usually. So you send, for example, your program is supposed to read some input from some form. But what will happen is that the adversary sends, instead of sending the names, that is the expected value, sends a really, really long sequence of, oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Sends a really, really long, so for example, let's say this is a form, there's supposed to be this box, there should be a name here, but instead of sending this name, the adversary sends a really long sequence of characters with some ideas behind it, and cause what we call a buffer overflow attack, which essentially what it does is that it overwrites the memory and injects some executable codes that can run. I'm going to give you examples. Most of you are probably familiar with buffer overflows, but we're going to discuss it on Wednesday. But generally, the idea here is that I don't necessarily force the user to download files. I actually inject it myself. The thing is, I need this injection to be a certain form. So it's not like I can inject it to any software, and I need to somehow trick the program to also run my injected code. So there's kind of a two-step that needs to happen. And then there are also more sophisticated examples of this injection that I don't need to even inject. I can even reuse the code that already exists in the system, which is called code reuse attacks, which we're also going to talk about. So the second one is kind of the most dangerous one because it essentially needs a little from the user. Is basically just all adversary. And the third one is the adversary can also somehow reprogram the system. This is usually goes under the category of what we call advanced persistent threat, APT. And the way this works is that this is usually a multi-stage attacks. It's very sophisticated attacks, which happens through various different steps. How many of you have heard the word Stuxnet, the Stuxnet attack? Okay, a few of you. So Stuxnet attack was this attack that happens on the centrifuges of a nuclear power plant in Iran. And the way it worked was it takes a lot of years actually for the intelligence service in Israel to penetrate into the systems of these nuclear reactions. And what they did, they eventually managed to, using a USB stick, to update the firmware of these centrifuges. So it's like a very, very, as I said, very sophisticated attack. But eventually what happens was that the firmware that's supposed to change like the speed of this motors and read the sensors and all, they managed to reprogram that and replace it with their malicious software. And that's how they managed to execute their malicious activity. So these are the three groups of attacks that can happen when we are talking about the digital world. So we're going to talk about these. Generally, the summary is that the attacker, one way or another, as we're going to discuss, managed to corrupt the memory. Okay, so all of these systems, you can categorize them under memory safety or memory corruption, which memory corruption, which means that what we are supposed to have in the memory is no longer true. Either we download something and run it, we inject something and run it, or we just reprogram it and run it. In either cases, we manage to run some malicious sequence of instructions, which we call malware. Okay, and this will cause some damage. What are those damages? It's the same things that we had before. It could be confidentiality, it could be integrity, it could be availability. This is just yet another way of doing this. So in terms of goals, it's fairly similar to what we discussed so far. It's just another way of impacting the system. Okay, so this is generally what we refer to as memory safety problems. As I said, mostly they are because of some form of an unintentional bug in the system. We're going to talk about these bugs, and we're going to talk about how do we fix these bugs. So we're going to focus a little bit on this aspects of IoTs. Unfortunately, with IoT, since IoT devices are in adversarial environments, they're more susceptible to these kind of attacks. They usually have less checks and balances and protections on memory compared to more high-end devices. That's why they're generally more vulnerable to these memory corruption attacks. All right, so before getting into this kind of different groups, let's actually talk about kind of malware as a whole and different types of malware. Then we're gonna talk a little bit about different, these three groups, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about defenses against this. And then on Wednesday and next week, we're gonna talk more about the details of these kind of attacks and so on and so forth. Before getting into the details of malware, how many of you have been infected with malware in your lifetime? Okay. Who wants to share what was the malware and what happened? Brandon, you want to share?
Yeah, I was trying to like download Minecraft mods. And there was some like Chromium, like it like pretty much like took away all my RAM. It was pretty disappointing.
Okay, and then what happened? How did you remove it?
I just
Oh wow.
I was pretty young, but my parents didn't know what was happening, so we just yielded to them.
So basically you had to buy a new computer.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it was a Mac Mini, so it wasn't like too crazy though.
Okay. Yeah. Can you speak louder so that you can also
My entire class.
entire class? Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was really lucky because I actually missed that discussion, but the PA had told us like we were trying to download it. It was like LT Spice.
Uh-huh.
It's like a circuit design software.
Yeah.
But I think it's like a more specific kind of bit.
Mhm.
PA had sent out a link to everybody and he said, yeah, guys, like download this.
Mhm.
He had sent the wrong link.
Oh,
And like
wow.
the entire class of 30 people ended up downloading malware and
Wow.
they had no idea how to get rid of it. So it was.
Do you know what happens to the computers?
I think that they actually had to like, some of them had to get like new computers.
New computers? What this happens at UCLA?
No, UC Irvine.
UC Irvine. Interesting. What did they do to the TA? Poor TA.
But most of them were able to like, he had sent out like really long instructions. Like,
Mhm.
how to do
Okay.
something. I didn't know how to follow them.
Anyone else wants to? Yeah.
Sure. I guess this is my grandmother. So she's getting old, right? And she got caught into like some sort of like remote access scam where they like download, install something and whatever.
Mhm.
But what ended up happening is she ended up getting a little suspicious.
Uh-huh.
And then and I guess she said that to like whoever was like had control of her computers.
Mhm.
And then they did something to brick her computer. Like it just stopped responding, like it just like turned off and like you try and hit the power button, nothing would happen.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So that was it for that computer.
Okay. And then who was the guy who got the access?
It's I think it was one of those like you visit a website and it's just like pop up like call this number, you're affected kind of thing.
Oh, that kind of thing. Okay. Any last person who wants to, any last interesting incidents? All right. So it seems that unfortunately malware is quite common. Most of them are some form of you being tricked to download things, but in many cases it's actually even worse than that. So the general definition of malware is any piece of software. We're mainly talking about software malware. There is also a hardware counterparts we usually call hardware trojans, which we're not going to talk about in this course. But generally, malware or any piece of software that created with some intent to cause harm. So there's someone who actually literally tried to write this piece of software to cause something. Then the motivations are infinite, of course, like usually some financial, but it could be also just for targeting availability. As I said, these days, cybersecurity also becomes kind of a weapon for many countries. So sometimes it's also has some political motivations. There are different types of malware, as you see in this picture here. There's actually this picture also needs to be updated because now there are new types of malware as well. But generally, malware, real malware are a collection of these. So there's not like, clear thing that say, oh, this is a virus or this is a worm. Usually you will see that these are kind of like combination of a bunch of things. So part of it is a worm and part of it is a virus. But there are some definitions for these that we're going to actually explain. But real examples are typically combination of this. And even the examples that we're going to give you, although they're kind of categorized in one of these categories, you will see that in fact they're actually a combination of these groups. So the difference between them really is what sort of goals they're trying to achieve and sort of their operation. Generally, this different type of malware are some of them are only for spreading. Some of them are for creating damage, and some of them are for both. That's why this how you categorize this kind of different kind of malware. The most common type of malware is a virus. Virus is a piece of software that attaches itself to some benign program. So that's why it's called virus. It stays mostly dormant until it's actually reached to a target program. So you download and there's this kind of like benign looking file. And then once it sees that it's in some host, then it starts actually executing. Typically, viruses don't want to just infect one computer. They want to spread as fast as possible to infect many other computers. Generally, the idea of malware is the most amount of spreading. That's why you see, for example, Windows malware are more common than, say, Mac malware or these like, I don't know, Android malware and so on and so forth, because essentially, since more people and more devices are using Windows machines, it's more impactful to write malware for Windows rather than writing malware for Mac. Although there's also some other discussions of like generally maybe it's easier for writing a malware for Windows versus Mac and so on and so forth, or Linux. But generally, the reason that you see significant more number of malwares for a particular system is they are more common, so the attackers are more motivated to write malware for them. There are many examples of viruses. The kind of like the very famous one that was very successful with this I love you virus. Has any of you seen this I love you virus or familiar with it? You are? Have you been infected with it? Okay, yeah. So this I love you virus is actually was looking like this. This is 2000, so that's why the graphic looks like this. So the way it works was that you got this from Outlook. So back in the day, many people were using Outlook. So something like this shows up, and this is kindly attached love letter. And then you open it, and this, in fact, is like a Visual Basic. How many of you know what is Visual Basic? Like, have you written code in Visual Basic? No, what you just know what is this? Okay. Yeah, so it was a Visual Basic code that runs. The reason that this virus becomes so effective and impactful was by default, Windows at that time didn't have any measures of not running scripts that when you download them. So by default, any sort of scripts that is added to the system can be executed without any permission. So that's why this Visual Basic scripts, basically, the moment that you download them, they start executing without any permission. So this was the code. And then this wasn't a legitimate text. Basically, the behind this legitimate text, there was a Visual Basic script. So if you think about this attack, as I said, usually most of these viruses or malware has multiple steps. In this particular case, the first step was social engineering. Social engineering, as you guys also explained, your cases of being infected by malware, most cases are reasons are social engineering. One way or another, you are tricked to do some actions. For example, in this case, it was a I love you letters, closer to Valentine's, probably some people would receive things like that, at least at that time, and they open it and they were like impacted by this. Social engineering, unfortunately, is still a very big challenge. They're more sophisticated. I think I told you about the story of the hotel rooms in Las Vegas last year, that the way that they actually infiltrated to the system was they call one of the operators and pretend that they are the managers and say that I'm the manager, I need to get access, give me the username, password, things like that. And they couldn't authenticate whether or not the person behind the phone is the real manager or not. And they unfortunately share their passwords and so on. So they actually managed to get into the system. It wasn't the password, it was the two-factor authentication. So they called them and say, okay, can you confirm and let me in, kind of thing. So that was kind of like the idea of the social engineering. As I said, this is kind of like getting more and more sophisticated. The second step was the execution of the script. In this case, this Visual Basic script. As I said, unfortunately, Visual Basic scripts at that time by default could be executed without any permission. So you don't even know that some scripts are being executed in the background. That particular script, what it was doing was overwriting lots of files, image files, changing and modifying text and documents, affecting MP3 and multimedia files. And again, at that time, you probably save a lot of things on your computers, which is different than now that most of the things are in the cloud, or you don't even have access to your MP3 files. You just, I don't know, stream it on Spotify or whatever. But then also what it does is also most of these malware, specifically viruses, tries to stay hidden. So they remove themselves from directories. They don't show up in these different checks. So they're trying to be as much as hidden as possible. So stealthiness is a big thing for viruses. And as I said, this Windows scripting host or WSH was enabled by default, and that's why they could run it without any issue. Another thing that this I Love You virus was doing was it tries to self-propagate itself. So not only it's kind of spread through one computer, but also spread through the contact list of the Outlook and try to send the same email from the infected person to all the other person. That's why they try to kind of as fast as possible to expand. So now then one infected can send many emails to some other people, and then the hope was the others also tricked into this. Yeah.
Like, if they're gaining anything, like any password or anything.
It's well, I mean, yes. I don't know what was the key motivation at that time. I think it was more of a denial of service because it was deleting a lot of these files. But I actually don't. We need to actually take a look to see who was behind. Like, was there any sort of financial benefit behind it? I know at that time it actually causes lots of issues for availability of these devices. But yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes it's also it's opportunistic, like they're not really having any malicious purposes, and then it's caused like a big chaos. But yeah, most cases it's actually there is some motivation behind. So yeah, so this like the spreading goes exponentially, and then it also kind of causes reboots and all that. So what were the motivation? Yeah, so actually damages was around tens of $billions. So Microsoft actually patched their Windows by blocking this VPS to execute it automatically, obviously. In many cases, they actually disabled forever. Also, like attachments and all has been email attachments, including Outlook was blocking suspicious attachments and not allowing to things being sent automatically. So after this particular virus, there are lots of things that happens that by now is default. So that's why now you cannot easily attach things to your email addresses, but still, as I said, it's not completely eliminated. Questions from I love you emails. All right. So that's viruses. That, as I said, there are tons of these viruses. Another class of malware is what we call worms. Worms are essentially itself doesn't do any damage. The goal of the worm is spreading. So it's trying to kind of like try to spread as fast as possible. To make the spreading faster, usually worms are written such that it's not host dependent. Because if it's host dependent, then they cannot spread easily. So they're written in a manner that they can spread as fast as possible. Spreading, there are various different reasons for spreading. One could be depleting the sources. I think that's what happens to your computer. That was just basically spread a lot, so that it just deplete the resources. But typically, the worms are used to be of service of another kind of a virus most of the time. And the famous example is the SQL Slammer. Anybody has heard about that one? So SQL Slammer was also like a very famous one that impacted a lot of ATM machines and all. So a lot of text here. It might be small, but essentially what happens is that there was like the attackers found a buffer overflow vulnerability on SQL's request on Microsoft SQL Server 2000 version. And what they did was they could run arbitrary codes on the SQL. They can then self-replicate and rapidly grow. And essentially the code was like tiny, right? Because for a buffer overflow, you just need a tiny piece of code. And then the way it works is that it just could then send other requests to other IPs, and this creates kind of a massive army of these controlled systems that then the adversary can basically use it for some form of a denial of service attack. So that's usually a very common way of using this in order to take down a website or service and so on and so forth. Within a few minutes, actually, this attack gets to like large scale outages in many, very important kind of websites and services, including many of the banks. And also ticketing systems of airports and airlines was also impacted by this. So that was a big deal also at that time. You probably can Google it and read articles about both of these attacks. The third group of malware is what we call Trojan. Trojan is a software that looks benign itself, but once it gets activated, it creates damages. So the software itself entirely is a Trojan. Trojans typically don't spread. They're just there. They typically have some form of a specific goal. Most of the time it's some form of a spying or data exfiltration. There's also a hardware Trojan that's kind of like similar to the software Trojan. It's attached itself to hardware. So you use the hardware, think that the hardware doing what it's supposed to do, but in very, very particular cases, they get activated and do something malicious. There are tons of examples of Trojans. One of them is Zbot. Again, if you're interested, click on that link and read about them. A more growing and I would say significantly more popular type of malware these days are ransomware. If you remember, the very first slide I showed you in this class was a ransomware. There was that kind of a red screen that says that your hard drive has been encrypted. In order to get your data back, you need to send this amount of ransom money to this particular address. Again, if you remember, I told you that unfortunately, because this Bitcoin and this cryptocurrency getting more popular and an easy and untraceable way of transferring money, ransomware is getting very, very popular and very lucrative business for many of these attackers because it can encrypt the hard drives. Most of these hard drives are important data in it. The user wants to retrieve that data, so they're okay to shell out some money in order to get their data back. And then, as I said, this ransomware is typically could be part of a bigger virus. So, for example, the goal of the virus could be running a ransomware eventually. So, for example, you download a file, I love you, instead of this running and changing the the MP3 files or the different files of your computer, that virus could then launch another payload, which would be a ransomware. So this is how usually these days these things are happening. The very famous ransomware was WannaCry in 2017 that also created lots and lots of news coverage at that time, and still various versions of WannaCry being used. WannaCry itself, I think its source code is somewhat available, so if you're interested to take a look at it, feel free to look. It's actually quite interesting and sophisticated piece of code, although not really long and really difficult to understand. Similar to ransomware or crypto miners. Crypto miners is also an emerging type of malware. They're not really malware by the general definition, but since it's actually stealing resources from the computer, it should be considered as a malware. The idea is that the adversary use your computer and use your power and the money that you pay for the resources of your computer in order to get their own benefit, which is mining. And there are tons of these attacks these days that kind of running this miners. And then miner itself, as I said, it could be also be combined with this existing attacks like a worm or a virus in order to be launched. So that's usually the idea of this crypto miners. Lastly, we have not lastly, but another thing that we have are these bots or botnets. Bots or botnets, again, they are not necessarily doing anything malicious by their own. The idea is that can I control a large number of devices in the internet in order to do something malicious together, okay? Typically, this is what we call distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks. The idea is that if I can have thousands of these devices, then all these thousands, then if they are coordinated, they can do something together. For example, this Mirai attack, which is also very, very famous, what they did was that the attack was scanning through open internet, scanning ports, and see if they can log into this various different devices. Interesting thing is that they found thousands and thousands of devices where their default password was either password or nothing, like default, or so there was like this some common words, some common passwords that they try on these devices, and they saw that they can actually successfully SSH into them or control them in different ways. What happens then they can run arbitrary codes in these devices. And what they found was that there are tons of these routers and smart toasters and I don't know, small refrigerators and Raspberry Pis. So these are the devices that this Mirai botnet actually targeted. It wasn't like laptops or PCs. There was this internet connected devices that can run some simple networking protocols. Once they have access to thousands of these devices, then they targeted this high profile website. So they targeted Bank of America and Netflix and a few others. And what they did is that within a few seconds, they basically shut them down. And there was a different reasons for this. One was they said that it's actually done by some countries, quote unquote Russia, to attack Ukrainian businesses at that time. There were some other ideas. There were other reasons for this to happen. But generally, the idea was they wanted to shut down services, important services, including Netflix and Bank of America and so on and so forth. So botnets is also growing area, especially in the context of IoTs. Unfortunately, botnets are becoming more and more feasible because now we have millions and billions of these devices connected to the internet, which means that any adversary can connect to them. So a good thing for you to remember that don't use default passwords even for like tiny devices in your home. Then we have adware and malvertising. These are kind of like two different things. Adware is a malware that is in form of advertisements, and sometimes it's just for annoyance. Malvertising is some way of forcing you to download some file. So adver is an ad that is actually a malware, but malvertising is like these kind of things that you want this and so on, and then you download it and you download some form of a virus on your system. And I think we are almost there. There is spyware, which what it does is basically trying to spy. Most of these things are what we call keyloggers. So many of these systems are trying to be installed on your system to log what keys you have pressed. The famous one is this dark hotel one, which essentially what it does is that it's trying to keylog the keyboards in many of these internet cafes and like public internet services. The goal is recording this, and sometime later the adversary will actually collect that information either from the same computer or from some form of a network communication between the spyware and the adversary. So for example, imagine that you're going to a public place and type something, and everything that you type is being logged using a keylogger. Then of course you are revealing information about what you did on that computer. Another specific type of malware, which could be any of those malware that I described, is what we call rootkit. Rootkit essentially has two parts. The idea of rootkit is that I want to get root level accesses to the system. Okay, so once I get root level access, then I can do whatever I want with the system. So that's really the goal. It could be, for example, a virus that gets rootkit based activity, but any sort of malware could be a rootkit as well, which it wants to get root level access to the adversary system. The reason that this has its own category is because in order to get root level privileges, there are level of sophistication it requires in the malware that's not typical for other malwares, such as let's say botnet. And then, as I said before, not all the malware requires you to download the file. There is what we call fileless malware, which essentially you never actually download any file or download any software. What the attacker does is actually injecting code into your system. And then even more interesting is that injection doesn't need to be injecting code and data. It could be some way tricking your own code to be executed in a certain way that cause something malicious. This is what we call a code reuse, which is the ultimate version of a fileless malware, because you never inject even any code to the system. You just manipulate the execution of the software, existing software in your system, such that it does something malicious. So of course there are questions about how do we insert the code and how do we execute that code, and that would be a story that we're going to talk extensively on Wednesday. Okay. All right. So the summary of what things that we said so far is that there are various methods of malware. There are different goals. There are different ways for them to expand and extract. And unfortunately, malware are on the rise. The reason for it is that first, there are more motivations for the adversary. Second, there are more devices for them to infect. Okay. All right. I think we can have a quick break here, and then we're going to come back and talk about this second part. All right. In progress. Great. So now that we learned about malware, there are two questions that one might ask. The first question is, how do we create malware? For obvious reasons, I'm not gonna explain that question. Instead, I'm gonna give you an answer to this question: and how do we defend against malware? And then generally, you can kind of think about like defending and attacking, kind of like two sides of the same coin. So some of the things you learn from defending, you also use it for attacking, or the other way around. But generally, defending, as I said multiple times in this class, is much harder problem to solve, because for defending, you need to defend against all different cases and all different scenarios, all different software, all different hardware. Versus for attack, you need malware that works on one device and can successfully do one thing. So generally, unfortunately, this is a very uneven kind of battle between the attackers and defenders. So how do we defend against malware? There are two big groups of solutions for malware defense. The first group is prevention. So you want to prevent the system from the attacks from happening. And the second one is malware detection. Prevention. Let's actually see if you have any suggestions for prevention. Anyone wants to suggest what should we do to prevent malware from happening?
Disconnect your computer from the internet.
Disconnect your computer from internet. That's always the best solution. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, having like a screener that doesn't let you like click like phishing links or something running that's like Chrome already has like a warning. It's like, oh, this might be suspicious. Don't click this.
So like some form of a pre-check on files that you might download. Good. Yep.
On download Norton McAfee.
Yeah, download nothing. So maybe connect it to the internet, but at least don't download anything. Yeah, that could be like a little bit more convenient. Anything else? Yeah.
Because you could also run like more secure operating systems, like there's Cube OS, I know, that like runs everything in like almost completely isolated things. So even if one is infected, like if your browser gets infected, it doesn't affect everything else on your computer.
So make it more sandbox, more isolated. Yeah. Anyone else wants to chime in?
And I guess that's TS is trying to say like download like antiviruses like Norton.
Well, antiviruses goes into the category of detection. Usually don't know what's the prevention, unless, for example, it gives you like something that Jacob was saying that, you know, whenever you're trying to download something, it gives you some form of a notice or warning or something like that. But yeah, so these are all good suggestions. There are many. As I said, once we're going to talk a little bit more about memory safety and memory security, you're going to learn a little bit about this. But generally, if you follow the practices of software and memory protection mechanisms, either writing software in a way that reduces the number of bugs, or having hardware or software solutions for protecting the systems against memory attacks like shadow stacking and canaries and all that, that's to reduce it. Second is using best practices. We heard some good practices. Don't use internet if you don't need to. Don't download things if you don't need to. Buy a good antivirus, things like that. Use your judgment and be proactive about it. And of course, you can always have protections either at the hardware level or a network level or a software level or operating system level. Usually these things are protected at the network level to make sure that there's no such a large scale attack to your system. And there are many more on the prevention side as well. And as I said, this is something we're going to talk about. Big thing on malware analysis is code analysis. Code analysis does two things. Code analysis is basically checking the program that you want to run to make sure that this program is not malicious. Okay, so you run this before actually executing the code. And the idea is that, for example, you download a file, you really want to run it, but you're not sure whether or not this code is malicious or not. You'd run these checks in order to make sure that this software is indeed not malicious. Okay, so this code analysis could be in two groups. It could be static analysis, that you essentially check the binary or the source code, scan the memory, scan the network, all those things to find some patterns. The idea is that, for example, if I know that I'm looking for a ransomware, I might look for particular patterns that resembles a ransomware. So generally, these checkings are usually pattern-based checking based on known knowledge about a system. The checks usually, the static ones are usually very difficult to run because static codes means that I might need to go through every single basic block in my system, which could be millions and millions. So instead, usually most systems are going for dynamic analysis. The idea of dynamic analysis is I'm just basically seeing the path that's actually taken for a given input. But keep in mind that the whole purpose of analysis is knowing whether or not your code is malicious. If you actually run it then that's defeat the purpose. So dynamic analysis is not really running the code in uncontrolled environment, is running the code in some very controlled environments or running partially the code in some controlled environment. So just don't be confused between dynamic analysis and actually running the code on the system without any protection. Malware analysis and generally code analysis is not just for malware, but also finding all vulnerabilities. So binary analysis typically is actually very, very active area of research for security researchers, where the idea is that you do run a bunch of these code analysis to find different bugs. So for example, as we're going to discuss next week, on Thursday, on Wednesday, you're going to see that, for example, many codes are vulnerable to what we call a buffer overflow attack, right? So you may want to actually and analyze your code to see if there is instances of possible buffer overflow vulnerability in your code. And if it does, you want to remove that, right? You want to rewrite the code such that those kind of things are removed. How do we do that? There are a whole bunch of different suits for that, which we're going to discuss next week. Things like fuzzing, static or dynamic binary analysis, concolic execution, these sort of things that we're going to briefly talk about hopefully next week. Which the idea is that we hopefully can find things like ransomware, but we also find other types of vulnerability in systems. These analysis also can be finding just regular bugs. So it's not just we always only care about security bugs, but let's say you want to also run a piece of software that is bug-free, that's actually do something. So many of these analysis are actually used for that as well. So it's not just security. That's where software analysis and security software analysis are basically, again, becomes very similar to each other. Their goals are slightly different, but the methods are very, very similar. All right, so now we talked about prevention, and that's something we're going to revisit soon. Let's actually talk a little bit about detection. So the idea is that unfortunately, all of these things, even though there's been years and years of research on them, unfortunately, there's no way that we can guarantee that piece of software is not malicious. The reason for it is these pieces of software are thousands and thousands of lines of code. Most of them, they are legacy codes. There's not much you can do in order to change them. So usually it's very hard for a code analysis systems to be able to close all the vulnerabilities. Okay, as a result, you'll always end up with some malware in the system. Another reason that you can have malware in the system is what we call zero-day vulnerabilities. This notion of zero-day vulnerabilities are systems that and then sometimes we call it also unknown unknowns. These are type of malware that you don't even know that they existed. So when I say, for example, I do things such as code analysis to find ransomware, the idea is that I know how ransomware is looking like, so then I can find those patterns. But if tomorrow someone comes with some XYZ ware, then I don't know even what should I look for, right? So my code, the code that I ship, might have these vulnerabilities from day one of its existence, because we never know that there's such a problem existed from the first place. So in their case, we're gonna always have some malware. So we need to come up with some detection models. So this is where we're gonna do what we call malware detection. Any suggestions on what we can use for malware detection? Anyone has any suggestions?
We can look at programs that are trying to access like memory and programs that aren't their own program.
Mm-hmm.
Or we can look for programs that are trying to create new files
Mhm.
or give information to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe programs that try to make themselves startup automatically.
Mm-hmm. So any sort of like behaviors that are not within of the expected behavior of that system, especially something that is dangerous, like I don't know, creating a file or adding themselves to the boot, or I don't know, accessing maybe some IO, things like that could be blocked. And that's usually what operating system does, and that's good. Anything else?
See if the code kind of resembles code that you know is from malware.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of also see if you see some code that being executed and seems like it's it's looks malicious, similar to what you know, and that's exactly what antiviruses does. So basically, they are signature-based systems that they have a gigantic database of signatures, and when they see a piece of code that is similar in terms of signature with those, they're gonna flag it as malicious, and they're gonna block it from being accessed and so on and so forth. Anything else? What else can they do?
Maybe you could like look at like where it like certain programs came from, so like source detection almost.
Source detection, okay. Maybe you can verify the author. Like actually,
Yeah.
many of the operating systems, if they don't verify the app developer or the signatures, they might warn you that I don't know, this is a third-party app. Do you want to run it and things like that? Sure. Any final comment? Okay. So the idea of malware detector is this, that I monitor behavior of my system. If I observe any what we call anomalous behavior, and I'm going to describe what is this anomalous behavior, I'm going to report it. Okay. So essentially, this is what we call anomaly detection. The idea of malware detection is essentially comes down to what we call an anomaly detection. What is an anomaly detection? The anomaly detection is this kind of four-step thing. So you start with some features, okay? So you say that, okay, these are the things I'm going to monitor, okay? The monitoring could be, let's say, network packets, could be behavior like writes, reads, and writes to the memory. It could be many things that I'm going to describe later. But generally, you'd set out a group of features. It could be just one thing, could be a big list of things that you monitor, okay? Then what you do is that you build what we call the reference model. Essentially, this is what you assume that is a correct behavior. This is what you call ground truth. Okay. So this is what you say that, okay, from these features that I'm looking at, if my program is doing similar to these kind of like behaviors, I'm not going to be bothered. I'm not going to be worried. But the moment I see something that is sufficiently different than this reference model, then I'm going to flag it as some sort of anomaly. This is something I haven't seen before. It may or may not be an attack, but it's just something new that I'm not sure about. The nice thing about this behavior is that it doesn't necessarily look for particular signature, although it can actually do this for finding particular signature. But in most cases, it just knows what is right. Anything that is not right is potentially labeled as anomaly. And the nice thing about this is that it means that it's also secure against zero-day, against unknown malware. Because as long as those unknown malwares are also look different than what you're expecting, then your system will be secure. So once I see this deviation, then I'll label this as malware. Of course, for detecting deviation, you need some form of a measurement mechanism, some metrics, and some algorithm for doing that, which we're going to discuss as well. So there are tons of questions that we need to answer. What features to use, what model to use, how to dynamically monitor these different features, how do you compare, what should you do once the malware is detected. So in the next few slides, I'm going to actually talk about these things. So let's actually start with this case study on malware detection. This is one of the first few papers that look into the malware detection from hardware perspective. Generally, malware detection, excuse me, anomaly detection is something that's been around from, I would say, early 2000. But starting 2010 onwards, is actually hardware malware detection also becomes interesting. So this is the paper called on the feasibility of online malware detection using performance counters, and published in 2013. And the idea was that I can actually look into some hardware characteristics of the system in order to detect malware. So let's see how. So the kind of intuition is quite visible in this figure here. As you can see in this figure, basically what it does is what it shows is that these are different programs. Okay, this like three are from same program with different inputs. This is a different program. This is a different program. Different programs. These are from a standard benchmark called spec, which is common to be used in many hardware systems and computer architecture systems. And this x-axis is basically time. So this is over time. And this values are basically just numbers. So what it shows is this particular feature. So this left column is basically showing you the number of L1 exclusive hits. L1 exclusive hits is talking about L1 cache, so level 1 cache. They basically show you how many cache hits you have for these programs. And the higher numbers is that for that period of time, you have more hits. The second one is showing you the number of arithmetic operations, macro ops that's been executed. Basically, how many adds and multiplies and things like that I have. And as you can see, there is a very interesting observation here. As you can see that there is a clear difference in kind of pattern and behavior of these different applications, right? So you can see that, like, for example, the first line is kind of like spiky kind of behavior. This MCF one is kind of like, going flat and very noisy. This H264 is kind of like, there is like a period of very fast activities and then nothing, and then another fast activity, and so on and so forth. So actually, if you're visually looking at these, you kind of can tell which application is being executed on your system. Another interesting thing is that this kind of varies between one feature to another feature. So if I look at the arithmetic operations versus number of cache misses or cache hit, I see different behavior of this. And thirdly, another interesting thing that you can see is that even within one program, you don't see just one behavior all the time. You kind of see varying behaviors based on kind of programs, what we call phases of the program. Some of them are kind of doing some form of a repeat, but some of them are not really any sort of like meaningful repetitive pattern. So they're kind of like something happens, but then something very different happens, and then something very different happens, and so on and so forth. But all of these is that there is interesting things, and main observation of malware detectors. In this particular case, these are hardware malware detectors. But generally, any malware detector is based on this fundamental observation that if I pick the right features, I can basically pinpoint and fingerprint the applications based on those features. Okay. And now the idea is that, for example, if instead of running this application, okay, some malware happens at some point. So, for example, I expect to see kind of this behavior from my regular program. And then if at some point during this execution, for example, show it this way. So this kind of like happens. And then I'm expecting to see this pattern. But then if I see something like this, right, it's clearly different than what I've seen before, which a clear example of what we call an anomaly. Okay. Whether or not this is an indication of some attack or not, that's a separate story. But what it clearly shows is that your program is doing something else. Sometimes this something else is because there is, I don't know, an interrupt in the program, there's some changes in the program. But in most cases, it means that something unauthorized is executing on your system. So you can actually detect. Another nice thing about this sort of behavior is that you can do this for failure analysis. So if there's some form of a failure in your systems, this could also reveal that failure. Okay. So as I said, the intuition of this kind of figure is that there are clear signatures. In this particular paper, as I said, these guys look into hardware features in order to extract. But as I said, there are other features that you can use. For example, what they've shown is that you can look into the number of branches, you can look into the cache behavior, you can look into the instruction mix. And then the question is, how do you measure these things? You can measure them usually using performance counters. Some of you have, how many of you have used like things like perf or pin? Okay, a few of you. So there are these tools that are actually available in like Linux. If you have privileges, you can like use perf in order to extract these things. So there's actually a long list of things that you can extract, including many of these features that I'm showing you here. So you can read them. There's another tool called pin tool, which you can actually kind of think about it as this, that you have assembly instructions. Pin tool basically add another specific assembly instructions and run that instructions for you, which basically what it does is that reads some sensors from you during the execution. Of course, this requires the system to be recompiled and re-executed, and it requires to have privileges. But if you are the defender, you will have those privileges and capabilities, so you can actually collect this information in real time. Questions? Okay. All right, so now that based on this, the question is, how do I build a detector? The first thing that you need to do is creating a data set. For all of these kind of research on malware detector, you need to create a data set. The data set needs to have two things. It needs to have benign software, and it also needs to have malicious or malware samples. If it only has malware or only benign samples, then of course your classifier won't work because it only sees one class. This is a binary classifier, so it needs to see both classes. Where do we find malware? There is actually lots of research and resources available for malware. There are malware databases like Malpedia that you can actually go and download malware from it. The second thing that you need to do is obviously you need to run this malicious. I don't know why this is messed up, but you need to run this malicious programs. The biggest challenge usually in like kind of malware research is how do I run malicious or malware programs without compromising my own security and or being flagged by university or other systems that I'm running this system on. Typically, there's lots of tricks that you need to apply. Typically, some form of isolation, sandboxing. Many of these systems create some fake network in order for the malware to think that it's actually connected to some internet or some host, but in fact, it's actually basically just talking to some fake packet, recorder or something that is just sending back the answers that it wants to. There's lots of hardware isolation for these because many of these malware, what they do is like they deleting files and all in your systems. So you want them to be prevented from that as well. But generally, you want to run these different malicious applications on your system. And one thing you have to be careful about is hardware and software variability that you need to expect. So, for example, some malware runs on one hardware but does not run on the other hardware. In order to achieve like a very sophisticated data set, you need to be able to run that. But these guys essentially, sorry about this, I don't know what happens here, but ignoring this, essentially what these guys did is they had their own kind of setup. They download a bunch of different malware, like old and new malware and benign software. They run it and collect it and creating this database. So once you have that database, the third question is, how should I do the classification? And as I said, this typically is a binary classifier. So it's either benign or malware. There are various options. Most of them are some form of machine learning. Machine learning could be as simple as like a decision tree or or a random forest or an SVM. It could be like a high-end deep neural network or these days transformers and so on and so forth. This paper is 2013, so even like I think ANN at that time, like it was artificial neural network, and this F thing was like they downloaded from some random website in order to be able to run like 3 layers of machine learning, which of course is very different from now that you just download, I don't know, like 10,000 layers deep neural network to run something like this. But as you can see, for example, in their case, it's fairly accurate after some false positive. And since this is a classifier, then you have 2 groups of things, right? So you have positive, false positive, and false negative, and true positive and true negative. But you can use different types of classifiers. Some of these malware detectors and anomaly detectors use an ensemble of classifiers. Some of them are just using one classifier. Some of them using things such as, neural networks, some of them using recurrent neural network like RNNs and so on and so forth. So that's a choice that one can make in order to what to use for the classifier. The important thing is that, of course, you want an accurate classifier. So what you want to do is you want to reduce the falses. You want to reduce the false negatives and false positives. You want to increase your true positive and true negatives. That's the basic 101 of any classifier. And then what it means is that you want to operate in this, true way, true negative and true positive. So you want to operate in this domain of this kind of like, area of the system. And of course, like any classifier, there are different things. There's accuracy, there's precision, and there's recall. I'm sure most of you have taken basic machine learning courses, so you know what these are. Anyone wants to say what is like accuracy? How do you define accuracy for binary classifier? Yes.
Wait a second, I'm mixing up precision.
Yeah, it's always confusing. So accuracy, this is a who wants to say what is accuracy? Which one is what is precision? What is recall? Calling all the machine learners. Give me that. Come on. Yeah. You are brave enough to give me accurate. Let's just start one more because I'm also not, so I'm not gonna pretend that I can say this correctly, but I looked at it yesterday, so maybe. So let's see if we can figure it out together. I have this slide. The next slide has the answer. So if you mess up, we can always go to that one. But let's see if we can figure it out. Accuracy.
A number of correct like labeling.
So give me in terms of FP, FN, TP, and TN, because that's so FP is false positive, false negative, true positive, true negative.
Then the denominator should be like the total, so
Mm-hmm.
and then it would be true positive, true negative on top.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Sorry. Yes, true negative plus true positive. That's my accuracy. Okay. And that's kind of seems to be an intuitive metric for a classifier. You want an accurate. But unfortunately, this doesn't give you how much you're accurate in each category, like whether you have large true positive or low true negative or what's going on. So that's why we have recall and precision. Anyone wants to say what is precision? Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is correct, but I think it's gonna be true positive over true positive plus true negative,
Yes.
and
So you want to see like how many are we? No, it shouldn't be true negative though.
oh, sorry, yes, false positive.
False positive or false negative? Yes, should be false negative. Right? So you want to see like the rate at which you detect things compared to the true positive cases, right? Because false negative should have been positive, but it's not. And true positive is true positive. So you want to say out of these things that you say that they are malware, what is the rate that you're actually predicting this correctly? So this is like how precise your system is in terms of detecting malware. And what about recall? See if anyone else is brave enough. Come on, you guys all have taken, I've seen, is there anyone who haven't seen this at all?
It says that precision is true positive over plus false, false positive.
True positive plus false positive?
Yeah, true positive over true positive plus false positive.
Oh,
I think that's recall when you get your.
like this?
Yeah, I think, yeah, then.
Okay, then I'm gonna trust you. I think it's false negative though, or maybe I'm.
I think that would be recall.
That's recall. Okay.
How many
Yes. Oh, right. Yes. Okay, so Brandon, you want to say that? Recall.
Oh, true positive over true positive plus false negative.
Okay. All right. So moment of truth is we are seeing the answers.
Yeah, so precision is like.
Yeah, precision is like how many are we really, how many of these predicted positive are actual positive,
Yeah.
right? So yes, you're right. So true positive is true positive over true positive versus false positive.
Recall is like.
And recall is how many of this are we actually detecting?
Are you
Like,
detecting all the?
yeah, so otherwise I can just like, report everything as true positive, and then that would like increase my increase my accuracy, but not necessarily my recall. So yeah, so accuracy to kind of like, again, that's something that all of us always are struggling. But accuracy is the ratio between all the true things that you say, either positive or negative, versus all the prediction that you have. Of course, you want this number to be as close as possible to 100. Precision is amount of positive that you're predicting, how many of them are actually positive, right? So you essentially you want to cut down on your false positive. If you are just reporting everything as positive, 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 your system is not precise enough. And then recall is kind of sensitivity measures that how things that you are actually predicting are correctly identified. And this is true positive divided by true positive versus false negative. So the ones that you miss that should have been labeled positive. And there is also an F1 score that is not necessarily a concept for itself, but it's kind of like trying to penalize you if you're like, miss badly on precision or miss badly on recall. So it's kind of like this times this divided by this added to this, and then usually you multiply it by 2 for some normalization. But this has nothing to do with security. It's just knowledge of basic stats that it's always not very trivial. But going back to our malware detection idea, remember that we want to use some features and we want to make some decisions, and we want our system to be accurate, whatever you want to define your accuracy. It's just pure accuracy. Is it recall? Is it F1 score? It could be area under the curve as well, and so on and so forth. So for example, these guys are looked at different types of malware. So these are all the malware families that they looked at. And as I said, you can download many of these things from this databases. This APK that they had was the number of malware that they had to run in order to create some form of a meaningful activity in their systems. And then these are numbers for the use for training and testing. And you can see that kind of like their detection rates varies. Some of them can be detected 100%, some of them can be detected 80%, 70%, 50%, and so on and so forth. And then, for example, if you read the paper, they discuss like why they detect some of the things. Generally, the idea is that I told you that the idea of malware is that you see some form of a change in your system, right? If this malware, what all it does is just maybe changing tiny things, then your feature detectors cannot really capture that. So there's not a big difference, right? So your malware could be stealthy in that way to not really changing significant things. And as a result, they stay hidden in most cases, unfortunately, in these malware. So it's not like, it always works all the time. The second problem with malware is what we call evasive malware. So the idea of evasive malware is this, that, I told you that, okay, so there is going to be, some features. I'm going to train a machine learning on the feature, and then I'm going to attack it. What the attacker can do is that then they can actually try to reverse engineer that machine learning model, whatever classifier that you have, try to create samples that that basically fool this detector as much as it can. So similar to what I told you about adversarial samples in machine learning, the attacker can do exactly same thing for malware as well, right? So the idea is that, okay, you as a defender chains, like you pick some features, let's say like number of branches or number of cache misses, you train some classifier and you detect malware. Great, good for you. Now the attacker, what they do is that they try to reverse engineer that malware detector. So they kind of create this shadow model, this reverse engineer model, that what it does is that try to mimic the behavior of that malware detector. And what they do now is that then once I have this kind of shadow model, I can then start writing and changing my malware such that no longer it can be labeled as malware. So I start with like changing one instruction and then another instruction and another instruction. So I can gradually change the program such that at some point this no longer is labeled as malware. And here's my evasive malware, right? So here's going to be something that machine learning model is no longer can detect. And that's a big challenge in these malware detectors, because if malware detector essentially is a static thing, you can always kind of try to kind of change this. Yes.
Is this like a black box attack or like some similar to that?
So the question is it could be black box, could be white box, could be gray box. If it's a white box, then I even don't need that shadow model anymore, right? I can basically just use this as my oracle to create a new malware. But if it's not, then I can always first create that reverse engineering model, and then it becomes white box, and then I can generate my malware. Okay, so that's a big challenge, and this is actually also a nice paper called Evasion Resilient Hardware Malware Detectors. It's kind of like a follow-up to the paper that I described. Which what it tried to do is basically trying to kind of fix this issue. Anyone wants to suggest how do we fix this issue? So how we make evasion resilient malware detector, assuming that now the adversary can basically, whatever we do first can be reverse engineered, and then I can change my malware such that it no longer can be detected. What can I do?
Maybe start with like maybe don't immediately block it, so they don't have something to like tell if it was blocked. So like log it for a while before blocking, so like a delayed response. I don't know.
A delay response, so that the adversary is kind of confused that some of the samples are not malware, but indeed they're malware.
Yeah.
Okay, but I mean, okay, maybe. Yeah. Some randomness in which part?
Detecting whether this a software is of malware.
Okay. So, for example, sometimes say that things that are not malicious are malicious, or things that are malicious are not malicious.
So then you must have a mechanism to like reverse that after.
So, like you tell others that, oh, we detect malware, but in fact you didn't. Okay.
You could try to train the model to like detect the evasions as well. Like you could have some like, like kind of how like a GAN works, like adversarial. So there's two sides, and you kind of have one side training the detector and one side trying to beat the detector and have them go back and forth, and then hopefully it detects even when they try to evade.
But then when you're done, then you're gonna have one model, right?
Yeah.
And then the adversary gonna target that. Right. So during your attack, you can do you can be more robust. But yes, that's actually one of the solutions. But yeah.
Also, so you could also just, if something gets passed and it gets reported, just add it to your model. Just retrain and using.
Yeah, if you have some form of adaptive, yeah.
Maybe move your like model into the cloud so that you can do your own monitoring. So if you see some malicious activity that seems like somebody's trying to train on against your model, you can try and block it.
But I mean, training against your model is, yeah, you can limit the queries, and that's actually one thing that many of these machine learning models does, that they don't let you to query their model a lot of times. So the opportunity for creating that reverse engineer is less. Good. Anyone else wants to say something? Yeah.
The aim idea is like keep on changing the model.
Keep on changing the model, exactly. So this is kind of using they call it moving target move target offense. Like you continuously move the target so that the adversary can never like settle on the exact model that you're trying to do. Do you want something?
Oh, and then I'm very bad at machine learning. Like, yeah, I was just thinking like we can do like normal like dynamic analysis on like the malware, or like we could like just store it in a sandbox and try to see if like it behaves in certain way. Like
Yeah, well, I mean that goes back to the prevent. You can always do those prevention things on top of your detection. The idea is that unfortunately prevention is not, most of the time is not enough. Even detection is also not always enough. But I mean, the idea is that we can do both, of course. That's what we usually do. Okay, yeah, these are all good ideas. I think most of you have said things. So you can have ensemble of detectors. Either you change it or you have a bunch of them. I think the paper itself was suggesting some form of switching between detectors. So such that if the switching is kind of random, then even if you're training it, you cannot really follow the same format. Adding some stochasticity, randomness to the system is also helpful. Either randomness to the weights or changing the weights. And then, as you suggested, adversarial training definitely helps as well. Although again, none of these systems are guaranteed to give you security all the time, but at least you can be aware of these evasive malwares as well. Okay. All right, so going back to our anomaly detection, remember I told you that I picked program features. In this particular examples that I gave you, program features was things such as cache misses and number of arithmetic instructions. Then we build a reference model by basically running lots of these standard benchmarks like spec benchmarks, and then downloading lots of malware from Malpedia and running that. And that's how they build their reference model. Then they dynamically look into these performance counters and use their model. In this case, they use, as I showed you, some form of a simple fully connected neural networks, and then some for random forests and things like that. And then if they saw some deviation, then they reported using accuracy or recall or precision and so on and so forth. Is this the only features that we can use? No, there are actually tons of papers that look at other features, network activity, radio frequency and their characteristics, different type of software activity, instruction mixes, like jump, system calls, function calls. All of that could be used as features. And in fact, many of these software malware detectors are relying on these things. There could be also tons of different hardware level malware detectors, things that you can look at, memory activity, cache branch prediction, so on and so forth. I don't have it here, but we actually did a lot of work on using side channels for malware detection. I'm not sure if Justin talked to you about that when we was talking about side channels, but essentially side channels like power or electromagnetic can also be revealing information about your systems. And while you can do it for example, breaking crypto and all that, there's also giving you the same sort of intuition as here, right? So if my device is running a particular program, I'm expecting to see a particular pattern of power, right? And then if I see a different pattern of power, then this is an indication of malware in my system, right? So the nice thing about that is that actually can be measured externally from the system. So my PhD was actually doing a lot of this work on malware detection using side channels and power and electromagnetic. And then in terms of models, what can we do? We can use collection of different things. As I show you, for example, machine learning is usually the main thing, but you can use deep learning. You can use combination of signal processing. Statistical models, for example, in the past, in some papers, we use statistical models. And the important thing is that you want to have some form of a good coverage, right? So you want to be able to see different type of inputs and path, such that the chance of you not seeing something as normal is less. Of course, any of these models that you have will have overhead. So for example, if you run like a sophisticated deep neural networks to detect malware, think about that. Most of these things needs to be running real time. So whatever you do has to be somewhat lightweight if you, for example, want to run it on some form of an IoT device. How do you compare? Usually some thresholdings, confidence level for machine learning, some statistical tests. These are the methods that you use. And then last thing, before I let you guys go is, what should I do once the anomaly is detected? There are various different things that you can do. Typically, malware detectors are hierarchical, which means that there is like a first line of defense for malware detection. Once you detect that malware, like once you think that this is a malware, then you invoke another level of detector maybe like, for example, the first line of defense is hardware, the second line is software. Or you can, for example, offload this kind of log to some more sophisticated, maybe a cloud-based environment. So there could be multiple checks before you actually raising the flag. This is particularly useful for cases where false positive is really a big challenge. So you don't want to, for example, completely shut down the system for something that you think it's a malware. You want to be 100% sure before actually shutting it down. Well, another thing that you can do is that you can always report it to some other systems or some other users. So for example, you kind of what we call raise the flag. So for example, you can notify the operator that we have observed some abnormal behavior. For example, many of the systems, cloud systems have these such things for you. For example, if someone sign into your account, you will get an email that there is a suspicious, sign into your account. Is it you or was it someone else? Similar, for example, banks usually have that. So for example, if there is some form of an activity, if there's like a big money that's been transferred from your bank account, you typically flag it and send you some message, and then you can either confirm it or reject it. So there's typically this. And then for all of these methods, there is notion of conservatism versus aggressiveness. You can be very aggressive and try to label everything as potentially malicious. The good thing about this is that the chance of missing a malware becomes so low. But unfortunately, as downside is false positive increase significantly. For systems that you're worried about false positive, you want to be a little bit more conservative, or you have this kind of hierarchical behavior. Okay? So that's it for the malware. Next time we're going to talk about instead of downloading this into your computer and running them, how can I actually be more subtle, and how can I inject this malware either through some code injection mechanisms. And then secondly, we're going to talk about, even if I don't inject anything, how can I reuse your code, your existing code in your system, in order to do something malicious? And there are some folks that are good at this already, so maybe we can pick your brain on that as well. All right, any final questions? All right, so you have 10 minutes back today, so good for you.